She was beaten for stealing bread, until the cowboy called her daughter. The whip cracked like thunder across her back. She didn't scream at first. She'd learned not to. Screaming only made it worse. But when the second strike came, leather biting through the thin cotton of her dress, the sound tore out of her throat before she could swallow it down. A child's wail, raw and helpless, the kind that makes men look away. But no one looked away in Salvation Creek. They stood in a half-circle around her, dust settling on their boots, faces hard as the desert stone. The baker held her by the arm, his grip iron and unforgiving. His wife stood behind him, clutching her apron, lips pressed into a bloodless line. The sheriff leaned against the post outside his office, arms crossed, watching. Not stopping it, just watching. The girl was maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. Hunger had a way of stealing years along with everything else. Her knees were scraped raw from being dragged into the street. Her hair hung in tangled knots down her back. And in her hand, still clutching it even now, even through the pain, was a piece of bread. Half-eaten, crushed between her fingers. "Thief," the baker spat. His voice carried across the street like a sermon. "She's been stealing from me for weeks." The girl shook her head, but no words came. Just tears. Silent and fast. The cowboy saw her from across the street. He'd been watering his horse at the trough outside the saloon, minding his own business the way drifters do. He wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble. He was the kind who'd seen enough of it to know when to walk away. But something about the sound of that whip, something about the way the crowd stood there, watching a child bleed for a piece of bread, made him stop. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, reins in hand, watching. His face was weathered and lined, carved by years under an unforgiving sun. His hat sat low over his eyes, shadowing whatever he was thinking. But his jaw tightened, and his hand, resting on the pommel of his saddle, curled into a fist. The whip rose again. Stop. The word came quiet, almost gentle, but it cut through the air like a blade. Every head turned. The cowboy walked forward, slow and steady, boots crunching in the dirt. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the sheriff. He looked only at the girl. And when their eyes met, hers wide and wet with fear, his steady and tired, something passed between them that had no name. The baker tightened his grip on her arm. "This ain't your business, mister." "I'm making it my business." The cowboy stopped a few feet away, close enough that the baker had to look up to meet his gaze. "How much does she owe you?" The baker blinked. "What?" "The bread." "How much?" "She stole it." "It ain't about money. Everything's about money." The cowboy reached into his vest pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a few coins. He held them up so the light caught them. Silver. Clean. More than a loaf of bread was worth. "This cover it." The baker stared at the coins, then at the cowboy, then at the girl, still trembling in his grip. "She's a thief," the baker said again, but his voice had lost some of its fire. "You pay for this, she'll just steal again." "Maybe." The cowboy's voice stayed level, calm. "Or maybe she was just hungry." The crowd shifted. A few men glanced at each other. The sheriff pushed off the post, hand resting on his gun belt. But he didn't speak. He was waiting to see how this played out. The cowboy took another step forward. Not threatening, just close enough that the baker had to decide. "Take the money," the cowboy said quietly, "and let her go." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind kicked up dust between them, swirling it into shapes that vanished as quickly as they came. Somewhere down the street, a horse nickered. A door creaked shut. But in that circle of men and judgment, there was only silence. Finally, the baker released her arm. The girl stumbled back, clutching the bread to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was. The cowboy dropped the coins into the baker's open palm without a word. Then he turned and walked back toward his horse, slow and unhurried, like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just stepped between a child and a whip. Like mercy was something he gave every day. But the girl didn't run. She stood there frozen, staring at his back, at the way his shoulders carried some invisible weight. at the dust on his coat and the worn heels of his boots, at the quiet, unshakable calm in the way he moved. He reached his horse and gathered the reins. For a moment, she thought he would just ride away, that he'd paid his coins, and that would be the end of it. Men like him, drifters, cowboys, wanderers, they didn't stay. They didn't look back. But then he glanced over his shoulder, just once. And in that look, she saw something she hadn't seen in so long she'd forgotten it existed. Not pity. Not charity. Something deeper. Something that asked no questions and expected nothing in return. Mercy. The crowd began to break apart, muttering among themselves, drifting back to their lives. The baker went inside, coins clinking in his fist. The sheriff tipped his hat and walked back to his office. And in less than a minute, the street was empty again, as if nothing had happened at all. But the girl didn't move. She watched the cowboy lead his horse down the street toward the edge of town. Watched him pause at the well to fill his canteen. Watched him check the saddle, adjust the stirrups, prepare to leave. And then, without thinking, without planning, she started walking. Her legs moved on their own. Small steps at first, then faster. The bread still clutched in one hand. Her other hand pressed against the ache in her back, where the whip had landed. She didn't know what she was doing. Didn't know what she would say. She only knew that if he left, she'd be alone again. And alone was the worst thing she'd ever been. He heard her footsteps and turned. She stopped a few feet away, breathing hard, eyes wide. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Him with his tired eyes and sun-scorched face. Her with her tangled hair and bruised arms. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked finally. She shook her head. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Like he'd heard it before. Then he did something she didn't expect. He held out his hand. Not to take something. Not to push her away. Just offered. Open. Waiting. And in that moment, standing in the dust of a town that had beaten her for being hungry, she made a choice that would change everything. She took it. She woke to find him staring at the fire, hands trembling around his tin cup. It was the third night since they'd left Salvation Creek, and she'd learned to sleep light. Learned to keep one eye half open even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. Men who offered kindness always wanted something eventually. That's what the streets had taught her. That's what survival meant. But this cowboy, this quiet, weathered stranger who'd paid for her crime and asked for nothing, he confused her. He sat cross-legged by the small fire, flames casting shadows across his face. His hat rested beside him in the dirt. His rifle lay within arm's reach, and his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard living, shook so badly the coffee in his cup rippled like a disturbed pond. She pretended to be asleep, watching him through her lashes. He didn't notice. He was somewhere else. Somewhere far away and painful. His jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't say. His eyes stayed fixed on the flames, but she knew he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing something else. Someone else. Finally, he set the cup down and pressed his palms against his knees, willing them to stop shaking. They didn't. She'd seen men shake before. Drunks outside the saloon. Miners with the fever. Gunslingers after a killing. But this was different. This wasn't sickness or whiskey or violence. This was grief. Old and deep and still bleeding. When morning came, he didn't mention it. He just saddled his horse, a big gray mare with kind eyes, and nodded toward the bedroll she'd slept in. "Roll it up tight," he said. "We got ground to cover." She did as he asked, fingers clumsy with the straps. She'd never owned a bedroll before. Never owned much of anything. The blanket smelled like dust and sage and something else she couldn't name. Something safe. They rode north through open country, the land stretching wide and empty in every direction. He rode in the saddle. She rode behind him, arms wrapped carefully around his waist, trying not to hold too tight, trying not to feel like a burden. He still hadn't told her his name. She hadn't told him hers either. For the first 2 days, they barely spoke. He'd point out a creek when they needed water, nod toward shade when the sun climbed too high, build a small fire when night fell, and heat up beans in a dented pot. He'd hand her a plate without a word, and she'd eat without asking questions. At night, he'd give her the bedroll and sleep on the ground with nothing but his coat. When she tried to protest, he just shook his head. "You're smaller," he said. "Cold will get you faster." She didn't argue, but she noticed. Noticed how he always positioned himself between her and the open prairie. Noticed how he kept his rifle close and his eyes sharp even when he seemed to be resting. Noticed how he'd wake at the smallest sound, a coyote's howl, a horse's nicker, the wind shifting through dry grass. He was protecting her, and that scared her more than anything. By the 5th day, she found the courage to speak. They were camped near a narrow stream, the water running low but clean. He was checking the horse's shoes, running his hand down each leg with the careful attention of a man who knew that a lame horse in open country meant death. She sat on a flat rock nearby, bare feet in the cool water, watching him work. "Why'd you help me?" she asked finally. His hands stilled. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Thought maybe she'd crossed some invisible line. But then he straightened up, wiping his palms on his pants, and looked at her. "Because you needed it," he said simply. "Lots of people need help. You help all of them." He shook his head. "No." "Then why me?" He turned away, back to the horse, and she thought that was the end of it. But then he spoke again, quieter this time. Almost too quiet to hear. "You reminded me of someone." She waited for more. It didn't come. That night, he told her she could call him Everett. She rolled the name around in her mouth like a piece of hard candy. Everett. It sounded strong, steady, like the man himself. "What do I call you?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. She hesitated. The name she'd been given at birth felt wrong now, tainted by too many years of hunger and running and being nobody. She wanted something new, something clean. "Sarah," she said finally. It was the name of a girl she'd known once. A girl who'd been kind to her, before disappearing like everyone else always did. He nodded. "Sarah." Testing it. Then he looked at her across the flames. "That's a good name." Something warm bloomed in her chest. Something she couldn't name. The days blurred together after that. They fell into a rhythm. Wake with the sun. Ride through the heat. Rest in whatever shade they could find. Beans and coffee, and sometimes jerky when the supplies allowed. At night, stories. Small ones at first. He told her about horses he'd known, towns he'd passed through, a ranch he'd worked once where the foreman had a dog that could herd cattle better than any man. She told him about the streets, about stealing just to eat, about sleeping in alleys and barns, and once, in winter, in a church where the preacher had chased her out with a broom. He listened without judgment, without pity, just listened. And slowly, carefully, she started to trust him. But there were moments, brief and sharp, when she saw the ghost in him. Like when she laughed at something he said and he flinched, just slightly, as if the sound had struck him. Or when she asked if he had family and his whole face went dark and closed. Or when she woke in the night and found him sitting up, staring at nothing, hands shaking again. He never explained, and she didn't ask. Some pain was too big for words. They'd been traveling for nearly 3 weeks when they reached a small settlement called Cedar Bluff. It wasn't much. A general store, a blacksmith, a few scattered houses. But it had supplies, and Everett needed ammunition and coffee. She waited outside with the horse while he went in. That's when she saw the woman. She was standing in front of the church, sweeping the steps. Middle-aged, with graying hair and a kind face. She looked up when Sarah approached, and her expression softened. "You traveling through, child?" Sarah nodded. "With that man?" The woman nodded toward the store. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied her. Not unkindly, but carefully. "He treating you right?" Sarah bristled. "He saved my life." The woman's expression shifted. Something like understanding passed across her face. "Some men carry their past like a heavy pack," she said softly. "Weighs them down every step. But it don't make them bad." "I know he's not bad," Sarah said. "Then hold on to him, child. Good men are rarer than rain in August." When Everett came out of the store, supplies tucked in a canvas sack, Sarah was still thinking about those words. About heavy packs and ghosts, and the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking. They rode out of Cedar Bluff as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from the dirt of Salvation Creek, she wondered not just who he was, but who he'd been before grief had carved him hollow. The locket fell from his saddlebag and landed in the dirt at her feet. Sarah stared at it. A small silver oval, tarnished black in places, attached to a broken chain. It had tumbled out when she'd been searching for the canteen. Everett had gone to check a noise in the brush, told her to stay put, and now it lay there in the dust like a secret trying to escape. She shouldn't pick it up. She knew that. But her fingers moved anyway. The metal was warm from the sun and surprisingly heavy. There was a tiny clasp on the side, so small she almost missed it. She glanced toward the trees where Everett had disappeared, heard nothing but wind through dry grass, and carefully pressed her thumbnail into the clasp. It opened, and everything changed. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased, but still clear enough. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a white dress with her hair in careful braids. She was smiling, not the stiff, formal smile people wore for photographs, but something real, something that reached her eyes that looked exactly like Everett's. Sarah's breath caught. She stared at the girl's face, at the shape of her nose, the set of her jaw, the way her smile seemed to hold some private joy. And beneath the photograph, engraved in tiny letters almost too small to read, Emma, forever loved. The sound of boots on stone made her jump. She snapped the locket shut and shoved it into her pocket just as Everett emerged from the trees. He was carrying his rifle, expression calm but alert. "Just a deer," he said. "Nothing to worry about." She nodded, heart pounding, unable to speak. He noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You all right?" "Fine," she managed. "Just thirsty." He handed her the canteen without question, but his gaze lingered on her face a moment longer. Then he turned back to the horse, checking the saddle straps, and the moment passed. But Sarah felt the weight of the locket in her pocket like a stone. That night, she couldn't sleep. They'd made camp in a shallow canyon, sheltered from the wind. Everett had built a small fire and heated beans, like always. They'd eaten in comfortable silence, and he'd given her the bedroll without argument. Now he sat with his back against a boulder, hat pulled low, rifle across his lap. Sleeping, but not sleeping. The way he always did. Sarah lay on her side, staring at the dying embers, the locket burning a hole in her pocket. Emma, forever loved. She thought about the way Everett's hands shook, the way he flinched when she laughed, the way he kept that careful distance even as he protected her, the way he'd looked at her in Salvation Creek, not like she was a stranger, but like he was seeing someone else, someone he'd lost. The pieces fell into place like cards in a crooked hand. He hadn't saved her because she needed saving. He'd saved her because he'd failed to save someone else. A little girl with his eyes and his smile. A daughter who'd worn white dresses and had her hair in braids. Emma. The question that burned in Sarah's chest was simple and terrible. What happened to her? 3 days passed before Sarah found the courage to ask. They were following a dry creek bed north, the land growing rockier and more unforgiving. The sun beat down without mercy, and even the horse seemed tired. Everett had been quiet all morning, quieter than usual, and his jaw was set in a way that meant he was thinking about things he didn't want to think about. Sarah couldn't hold it in anymore. "Tell me about Emma." Everett's whole body went rigid. The horse felt it and tossed her head nervously. For a long moment, he didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge she'd spoken. Sarah thought maybe he hadn't heard, or maybe he was pretending he hadn't. Then he pulled the horse to a stop. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, and walked a few paces away. Stood there with his back to her, shoulders tight, hands opening and closing at his sides. Sarah slid down from the saddle and waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel scraped across raw wood. "How do you know that name?" "I found the locket," she admitted. "It fell out of your saddlebag." I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. She was my daughter. The words came out flat. Empty. She died 4 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days. I was working a cattle drive 200 miles away. By the time I got home, she was already in the ground. Sarah's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Her mother couldn't look at me after that. Said I'd chosen the ranch over our child. Maybe she was right. He turned to face her then, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it hurt to see. I failed her, Sarah. Failed them both. I wasn't there when they needed me most. You didn't know. Doesn't matter. His voice broke slightly. I should have been there. Should have felt it somehow. Should have known. The silence stretched between them, heavy and aching. Is that why you helped me? Sarah asked quietly. Because I reminded you of her? Everett looked at her for a long time. Really looked at her. Not at Emma's ghost, but at Sarah herself. At the girl who'd stolen bread because she was starving. The girl who'd learned to sleep light and trust no one. The girl who was still here, still standing, still asking questions even when the answers hurt. At first, he said finally. Yeah, at first that's why. Saw you in that street getting whipped for being hungry, and all I could see was Emma. All I could think was that if she'd lived, if I'd failed her another way, maybe she'd have been you. Alone and scared and hurting. And now, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Now, he shook his head slowly. Now, I know you're not her. You're stronger than she ever had to be. You survived things she never had to face. But that doesn't change what I owe. You don't owe me anything. I owe her. His voice was firm now. Final. I couldn't save my daughter. Couldn't be the father she deserved. But maybe, he stopped, swallowed hard. Maybe I can do better this time. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears. Something else. Something complicated and warm and terrifying. For weeks, she'd wondered why this stranger had helped her. Why he'd given without asking. Protected without demanding. And now she understood. He was trying to fix something that could never be fixed. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that he was trying. That he'd looked at a broken world and decided to put one small piece back together, even if it couldn't be the piece he'd lost. She pulled a locket from her pocket and held it out to him. He stared at it, then at her, surprise flickering across his weathered face. You should keep this close, she said softly. Emma deserves to be remembered. He took the locket with shaking hands, opened it, looked at his daughter's face for a long, quiet moment. Then he closed it carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. Thank you, he said. Sarah nodded. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something that had been fragile became stronger. The cowboy who'd saved her wasn't perfect. He was broken and haunted and carrying grief that would never fully heal. But he was here. And he was trying. And maybe Sarah thought that was what family really meant. The sheriff's hand rested on his gun belt, and Sarah knew they were in trouble. It was the coldest day of winter, snow falling soft and steady over the small town of Bitter Springs. They'd come here for supplies, coffee, flour, a new blanket before the hard freeze set in. But the moment they'd stepped into the general store, the whispers had started. And now, barely an hour later, they stood in the middle of the frozen street facing the law. The sheriff was a big man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much. Behind him stood a small crowd. The store owner, a rancher and his wife, the preacher, a widow in black, all watching, all judging. Where you folks from? The sheriff asked. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of calm that came before a storm. Up north, Everett said evenly. Just passing through. Passing through. The sheriff nodded slowly, like he was tasting the words. And the girl? With me. I can see that. The sheriff's eyes moved to Sarah, lingering, calculating. How old are you, child? Sarah's throat went dry. 10, sir. Maybe 11. I don't rightly know. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff looked back at Everett. She your daughter? The question hung in the air like a knife. Everett's jaw tightened. Yes. Got papers proving that? Don't need papers to know what's true. The sheriff's expression hardened. See, that's where you're wrong, friend. We got laws in this territory. Laws about men traveling with children who ain't theirs. Laws about men who taken strays without proper claim. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She looked at Everett, saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his face. He was measuring the situation, counting the men, calculating whether he could get her out if things went bad. The rancher stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt. We heard about you too. Heard you've been traveling together for months. A grown man and a little girl with no kin, no papers, no proof of nothing. He spat into the snow. Looks suspicious to decent folk. There's nothing suspicious about it, Everett said, voice low and steady. I'm taking care of her. That's all. Taking care of her. The rancher's lip curled. Or using her? Everett moved, so fast Sarah barely saw it. One moment he was still. The next he had the rancher by the collar, lifting him onto his toes. The crowd gasped. The sheriff's hand went to his gun. Say that again, Everett said softly. Dangerously. Go on. Say it. Everett, don't. Sarah reached for him, but he didn't let go. The rancher's face had gone red. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Then everyone's a fool. Everett shoved him back. The rancher stumbled, but stayed upright. I found her being whipped for stealing bread. She was starving and alone, and nobody gave a damn. So I did. I gave a damn. And if that makes me suspicious in your eyes, then your eyes need checking. The sheriff drew his gun, not aiming, just holding it. A warning. Let's all calm down, he said. Nobody needs to get hurt here. He looked at Sarah again. Girl, I need you to tell me the truth. Did this man take you against your will? No. Is he your bloodkin? Sarah hesitated. The lie was right there, easy to grab. But lies had weight in towns like this. Lies could get them both killed. No, she said quietly. He's not. The crowd erupted. Voices overlapping. Angry. Afraid. The widow clutched her shawl tighter. The preacher shook his head. The store owner backed toward his shop, like he wanted no part of what was coming. Then by law, the sheriff said, I got to take you into custody, mister. And the girl goes to the church until we figure out where she belongs. She belongs with me. Everett's voice was steel. That ain't for you to decide. The hell it isn't. Two deputies emerged from the sheriff's office, rifles in hand. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was spiraling. This was going to end in blood. She could feel it, could see it in the way Everett's hand drifted toward his gun, the way the deputies spread out, the way the crowd pulled back, giving them room to kill each other. Wait. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip through the cold air. Wait, please. Everyone stopped. She stepped forward, putting herself between Everett and the sheriff, between the cowboy who'd saved her and the law that wanted to tear them apart. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came out in white clouds. But she stood firm. You want proof, she said. You want papers and blood and something that makes sense to you? Sarah, don't, Everett started. She ignored him, kept her eyes on the sheriff, on the crowd, on all these people who thought they knew what family was supposed to look like. I don't have papers, she said. I don't have a birth record or a baptism or anything that says who I am. I was nobody before him. I was a thief and a stray and something people stepped over in the street. But her voice caught. She steadied it. He saw me. When everyone else saw trash, he saw someone worth saving. He paid for my crime. He gave me food. He taught me to ride. He keeps me warm and safe, and he never once asked for nothing in return. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. He ain't my blood, Sarah continued, louder now. But he's the only father I've ever known. The only one who ever cared if I lived or died. So if you want to take him, you'll have to take me too. Because I ain't going nowhere without him. Silence fell over the street. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff studied her face. Then Everett's. Then hers again. Girl, he said slowly, you understand what you're saying? You're claiming this man as your kin. Yes, sir. Even though he ain't. Blood don't make family, Sarah said. Love does. And he loves me. Maybe not the way he loved. She stopped herself. That wasn't her story to tell. He loves me the way a father should, with his whole heart. And I love him the same. She turned to look at Everett then. Really look at him. At the man who'd stepped between her and a whip, who'd given her a name and a bedroll and 3 months of kindness without conditions, who carried his grief like a second skin but still found room to care for someone else. I love you, Pa, she said. Clear and strong and true. Everett's face crumpled. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see the tears he wouldn't let fall. Then he straightened, jaw tight, and nodded once. I love you too, daughter. The word hung in the frozen air between them. Daughter. Not a lie. Not pretend. A choice. A truth they'd built together out of mercy and time and the slow, careful work of healing. The sheriff holstered his gun. Well, he said after a long moment, I reckon that settles it. The rancher sputtered. You can't be serious. I'm dead serious. The sheriff looked at him hard. Law says a child needs a guardian. She's got one. Law says that guardian's got to care for her proper. I see no evidence he don't. And I sure as hell ain't in the business of tearing apart families just because they don't look the way you think they should. He turned back to Everett. You take care of that girl. You hear me? Because if I hear different, I'll come find you myself. Understood, Everett said. The sheriff nodded. Then he looked at Sarah one more time. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. You're a brave one, girl. Your pa's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Sarah said. The crowd began to disperse. Slow at first, then faster. Whispers followed them, but quieter now. Less angry. The preacher tipped his hat. The widow gave Sarah a small, sad smile. Even the rancher backed off, though his face stayed sour. When they were alone again, just them and the falling snow, Everett knelt in front of Sarah. Put his hands on her shoulders. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. You didn't have to do that, he said hoarsely. Yes, I did. You could have gone to the church. Found a real family. You are my real family. Sarah's voice was fierce. You're my pa. And I'm your daughter. And that's the truth. The only truth that matters. Everett pulled her into his arms then, held her tight against his chest while the snow fell around them. And for the first time since Emma died, since his wife left, since his whole world had crumbled into dust, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be built from broken pieces. That mercy, once given, could grow into something unshakable. That family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose. Every single day,